First question tonight comes from Jenny Stoddard.
Professor Krauss, science claims more than method. In fact, it claims to offer us a future hope. But in and of itself, science has no ethical boundaries. What are the values, if God and faith are to be excluded, that will actually measure the impact of science on human life?
Well, I think it's wrong to say that science has no ethical boundaries. Science is based on telling the truth, which is a really important ethical boundary. It's one that I don't think religion shares, in fact. The point is that telling the truth and full disclosure, and also doubting yourself, being skeptical of because the easiest person to fool is yourself. And I think all those values are, in fact, the very values we need for a better society. All those things, if any of those things were true in my country, in Washington, it would be a better place. And so I think that science can offer a better world, and in fact a world that's more ethical, and to the extent that you talk about morality, than you can get from books written based on Iron Age peasants who didn't even know the Earth orbited the sun. I really think that, in fact, if you look at democracies and science has not flourished in countries that don't have democracies, and democracy can't function without the very things that science is based on: an informed public, an informed legislature, basically who base public policy on empirical facts instead of ideology. And that's very important in my mind.
So just briefly take the other side of the equation, and that is the impact that religious ethics have upon science.
It has none. None whatsoever. In fact, religion never enters into science.
Well, for example, the Catholic Church has strong positions on reproductive technology, for example, so it does enter into the science market in that regard.
Well, whenever they do, they get it wrong. Absolutely. I mean, when the Pope says that, say, condoms contribute to AIDS in Africa, that's not science, that's ideology, and it's nonsense because, of course, we know that empirical evidence tells us that, in fact, women whose husbands have AIDS should be using condoms. It's not an ideological question, it's a scientific one, and we want to save lives. And so I think that whenever you see the church or religion trying to intrude upon science, they almost always get it wrong.
Let's go to John Dixon. Should the church, the values of faith and God, as the questioner asked, should they be involved in science in any way?
I agree with almost everything Lawrence just said, actually, except I would beg to differ about whether science can actually produce an ethic. I think human beings produce an ethic, and we decide whether to use science positively or negatively according to our worldview. And history is littered with examples of science being used brilliantly, ethically so, and times when it's used badly. I disagree that science has any ethical import. It's a neutral discipline, and it's a wonderful discipline. The little quips that I heard throughout about science is all about humility and so on, I love. In fact, Peter Harrison of Oxford University, who's one of the world's leading historians of science, thinks that it was a revolution in this doctrine of humility that flourished in the 14th and 15th centuries that got science going in Europe, in part. It's not a total explanation, but that as Augustine philosophy developed, which basically said human beings are flawed, so we need better techniques. We can't trust our brains. We need to observe. And this Augustinian philosophy grew out of Christianity, as you know. And so Christianity probably is in part responsible for science in the first place. I agree that it shouldn't stick its head in now and tell the scientists what to do. My view is let the scientists do the science. Well, and let religious believers do what they do.
Well, I agree with you. I think historically, if you look at it, because the church was the only game in town in the 15th century, science arose out of religion, and it's great, and it served a good purpose, and now we should just put it aside.
Except in China, of course, where I was going to say, except in China, of course, where science flourished without this kind of religion at all. But let's just move on quickly. I want to hear from the rest of our panelists. Quite a lot to get through. Tanya Plibersek, your thoughts.
I think that everybody should ask themselves, what is a life well lived? What do we owe to other people, not just what is owed to us? And some people are motivated to do that because they have religious beliefs and their values system says that God asks that of you. Other people ask that question of themselves not because God has asked it of them, but because they have thought themselves, how do I live my life well? What do I owe to others? And I've known some very moral atheists and I've known some pretty nasty Christians. I don't think that living a life well depends on an external system imposed upon a person, but I do think you need to question, and I do think you need to examine your own values and motivations, behaviours and beliefs often.
Cindy Pan.
Well, certainly I think ethics, not necessarily religious ethics, but ethics generally has a central and vital role in science, certainly from a health perspective. And I was always taught by a professor that that in fact ethics was the starting point for any study. If it didn't pass the ethics committee, they didn't look any further, because if the ethics is bad, the science is bad, and that was basically the dictum. If the ethics is bad, you don't need to read any further because the science is by definition then bad. And certainly in terms of religion and science, I mean, Lawrence was referring to the issue of, Catholicism and condoms and HIV transmission. I was reading, in the context of, all the cardinals sort of jockeying for the new position. And apparently this African cardinal is considered very progressive because he has said that, that in these sort of couples where one partner is HIV positive, that condoms might have a role. So, I mean, obviously that is definitely so, but I find it interesting that that's considered progressive, because I think most people would consider that obvious. And then in terms of...
But that's progressive for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, and then in terms of the Catholic position on abortion, and even some non-Catholics' position on abortion, I mean, there was a recently highly publicised case of that woman in Ireland who died in a major public teaching hospital because a DNC wasn't carried out, and there was certainly no good medical reason not to, but I think it was more of a sort of a religious thing, and I'm sure many of the doctors there felt very tortured by that, having to let a perfectly healthy woman die. And personally, I think that there's nothing ethical about allowing someone to die in those circumstances on religious basis. So I think their religion and ethics actually become an oxymoron. Not always, but in certain instances, definitely.
All right, it's good underpinning for the discussion we're about to have. You're watching Q&A. Remember, you can send your web or video questions to our website. The address is on the screen.